Dr. Henderson's office smelled of antiseptic and old furniture. Clara Simmons sat on the edge of the chair, clutching her purse so tightly that her knuckles were white. A middle-aged doctor with graying temples was scrutinizing the papers on his desk, occasionally adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose. A light drizzle drizzled outside the window, droplets dripping down the glass, leaving crinkled paths. "Miss Simmons," Dr. Henderson said at last, raising his eyes and folding his hands on the table. "I'm afraid I don't have very good news for you. Your test results showed an infection." Clara already knew. From Dr. Henderson's face, from the way he avoided looking directly at her, from the tense silence in the office, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Still, when he said the word syphilis, it was as if the world had tilted sideways and my ears were ringing. Is that a sure thing?" she whispered, her voice sounding alien, distant. "Blood tests don't lie." Dr. Henderson leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses, wiping them with a white handkerchief. "But I want to reassure you. The disease is at an early stage, perfectly treatable with modern antibiotics. With proper therapy, there will be no long-term consequences. You are young, healthy, it's just an unpleasant episode in your life." Clara nodded, not hearing his reassuring words about treatment regimens and favorable prognosis. There was one obsessive thought in her head. How could this have happened? She had always been careful, never led a promiscuous life, never dated questionable men. She had only had one partner in the last 2 years, and she trusted him completely. "It's very important to notify everyone with whom you've had intimate relations in the last 6 months," the doctor continued, putting her glasses back on and writing a prescription. "They too should be examined and, if necessary, treated. Syphilis can be asymptomatic for quite a long time, especially in men. Your partner may not even be aware of the disease. 6 months. Clara mentally counted. There had been no one in the last few months. The last time she'd been intimate with a man had been in late January, but the incubation period. The doctor had said something about an incubation period that could last from a few weeks to 6 months. "Doctor," she interrupted his monologue about penicillin and control tests. "What if it was longer than 3 months ago? Let's say 6 months." "Then it's all the more important to inform this person." Dr. Henderson put down his pen and looked at Clara carefully. "Perhaps he was infected by someone else and doesn't even know about his disease, and perhaps—" He hesitated, choosing his words. "He does know, but he didn't think it necessary to warn you. Unfortunately, it happens." The doctor's last words struck her heart like a cold needle. Clara closed her eyes, trying to calm down and chase away the sudden nausea. Nathaniel knew. Of course he knew. Otherwise, why the sudden coldness in February, the abrupt breakup, the refusal to see each other, the strange explanations about sin and repentance? "I'll write you a prescription for antibiotics." The doctor's voice sounded distant. "The course of treatment will take 3 weeks. It is very important to take the pills strictly according to the schedule, not to skip appointments. And refrain from intimate relations until the complete cure." Leaving the clinic on the street, Clara felt her legs jacking up. The light rain had turned into a downpour, the drops hitting her face, mixing with unsolicited tears. She leaned against the wall of the red brick building, breathing deeply of the cool air, soaked with the smell of wet leaves and asphalt. People were passing by under umbrellas, hurrying about their business, sheltering from the rain, and her world had just collapsed completely and irrevocably. The bus home seemed interminably long. Clara sat at the window, looking out at the rain-blurred streets of Broken Arrow and trying to comprehend what had happened. The elderly woman across the street was telling her companion something about her grandchildren. The school children in the back of the bus were loudly discussing the upcoming weekend. Normal life went on, but Clara felt cut off from it by thick glass. The drive from the bus stop to home passed like a blur. Clara lived in a small one-story house on a quiet Maple Street that she had inherited after her mother's death 2 years ago. The house had been built in the 50s, but it was well kept. Her mother had always taken great care of it. White walls, green shutters, an ivy-covered veranda, and the little garden behind that her mother had loved so much, where she had grown tomatoes, roses, and lavender. Climbing up onto the veranda, Clara reached for her keys with trembling hands. On the doorstep lay a few flyers, wet from the rain. She picked them up, glancing through them absent-mindedly. Offers from a pizzeria, discounts at the supermarket, an invitation to a charity concert at the town library. The usual peaceful life of a small town. Inside, the house greeted her with familiar silence and a familiar smell, a mixture of old wood, furniture wax, and the faint scent of lavender. Her mother had always kept bags of those dried flowers in the linen closets, and even 2 years after her death, the house retained that smell of childhood and safety. Clara walked into the living room and sank into an old velvet armchair by the window, her mother's favorite seat. On a table nearby were several silver-framed photographs. The centerpiece was a picture of her and her mother last Christmas, both in beautiful dresses, both smiling for the camera in front of the decorated tree. Her mother was already sick at the time, but she hid it, didn't want to spoil the holiday. Ruth Simmons died of pancreatic cancer 6 months after this photo. The disease progressed quickly, doctors said a few months, but the mother held out for almost a year, as if unwilling to leave her only daughter alone. She left in May, when her favorite lilacs were blooming in the garden. After the funeral, Clara thought she would never get over such grief. Her mother was everything to her. Her best friend, her counselor, her support. Clara did not remember her father. He left when she was 3 years old and never appeared in their lives again. Her mother raised her daughter alone, working as an administrator in a dental clinic, saving on everything to give Clara a good education. After her mother's death, Clara plunged into work as a life-saving routine. The position of junior accountant in the construction firm Perry & Associates did not bring much pleasure, but provided stability and allowed not to think about the emptiness in the house. Numbers didn't lie, betray, or break hearts, unlike people. The debit and credit columns had their own logic, their own justice. Colleagues treated Clara well, though they kept a somewhat aloof attitude. She was quiet, executive, never participated in office gossip, and rarely went to lunch with others. Her boss, Mr. Perry, appreciated her neatness and punctuality, and assigned her the most complicated calculations. It was the quiet, predictable life of someone who just wanted to be left alone. It was at Grace Light Church that Clara sought solace after the loss of her mother. Her mother was a woman of faith, taking her daughter to service every Sunday at the small Baptist congregation on Church Street. After her mother's death, Clara continued to go there, not so much out of faith but out of habit, out of a need for familiar faces and rituals. The small red brick church held no more than 80 people. The congregation consisted mostly of elderly people, middle-aged families with children, and a few young couples. No one asked questions about their personal lives or prying into their souls with unsolicited advice. Here you could just sit on a wooden pew and listen to the choir singing and the pastor's melodious voice. Nathaniel Brooks had come to their church 3 years ago, replacing the old Pastor Williams, who had retired. Young, only 33, energetic and charismatic, he made an immediate impression on the congregation. His sermons were vivid, modern, and he was able to speak of eternal truths in simple, understandable language. The congregation grew noticeably under his leadership as people came to hear the new pastor, bringing friends and neighbors. Nathaniel was married to a quiet woman named Delora, who was a few years older than he was. She ran the children's Sunday school class, helped with organizing church activities, and almost never gave her own opinion. It was said that they had married while still in seminary, that Delora helped her husband study while working as a secretary to provide for the family. Clara at first treated the new pastor with the same quiet respect as the previous pastor. She attended services regularly, participated in church life, and helped with cleaning and organizing holidays. Nathaniel knew her by sight, sometimes saying hello after services, but not much more than that. Everything changed a year and a half ago, shortly after the first anniversary of his mother's death. Clara was going through a particularly difficult time. The spring reminded her of the loss. The house seemed too big and empty. The work was not satisfying. She began to linger more often at the church after services, helping with the cleaning, finding temporary oblivion in these simple tasks. The affair began imperceptibly, almost by accident. One evening, as Clara was cleaning the altar after a particularly crowded service, Nathaniel approached her. "Thank you for your help, Clara," he said, his hand touching her shoulder for a moment. "You are a true pillar of our community. I don't know what we would do without you." The touch lasted only a second, but Clara felt something change in the air between them. In the following weeks, Nathaniel began to talk to her more often, inquiring about her affairs, asking for advice on the church's business affairs. He learned that she was an accountant and asked her to help with the congregation's financial records. "You have such an analytical mind," he said, leaning over the papers beside her, "and such steady hands. People like you are the backbone of the church." Clara had never received compliments like this before. At work, she was taken for granted. Men paid little attention to her. She was too quiet, too ordinary. But here was a charismatic, handsome man saying such words to her, looking at her with such warmth in his eyes. The first kiss happened in an empty church on a late October evening. Clara had come to bring him the church budget reports, and Nathaniel was working on the Sunday sermon by the light of a table lamp. The stained glass windows were barely illuminated by the streetlights, creating an intimate, almost magical atmosphere. They were sitting side by side at his desk when he suddenly turned to her and said softly, "Clara, you're so beautiful when you're focused. You have such an intelligent, kinder face." She looked up, met his gaze, and he kissed her softly, tenderly, as no one had ever kissed her in her life. There was so much warmth in that kiss, so much promise, that Clara felt something thaw inside her after months of cold loneliness. The next 4 months were the happiest of Clara's life. They met in secret at church after services, when everyone went home, sometimes at her house, when Delora went to visit her sister in a neighboring town. Nathaniel said that his marriage was long dead, that his wife did not understand him, that they lived like strangers. He promised that he would divorce her, that they would be together openly, that God would forgive them because their love was real and pure. Clara believed every word. In his arms, she felt needed, loved, alive. Nathaniel was a tender and passionate lover. He knew how to say the right words, give the right touch. For the first time in her life, Clara understood what real intimacy, real passion was. And then it all came to an abrupt end at the end of January. Nathaniel became cold and distant, avoided meetings in private, and to her timid questions answered that they needed to think, that everything was too complicated, that he could not leave his wife. The last time they had been intimate was January 31st. Clara remembered the date because the next day was to be the beginning of the great quadricentennial. "It was a sin, Clara," he said in mid-February, when she finally got him to explain himself. They were standing at the altar after the evening service, and he wouldn't look her in the eye. "We have given in to the temptation of the flesh, but now we must repent and never do it again. God demands sacrifice from us." Clara didn't realize such a drastic change at the time. She thought he was afraid of exposure, that his conscience was stronger than his feelings, that his religious convictions had taken precedence over his human weaknesses. She tried to understand, to forgive, even agreed to stay in the congregation, although it was unbearably painful to see him with his wife every Sunday. Now she understood the real reason for the breakup. Nathaniel had learned of his illness, perhaps from some other woman, perhaps after a routine checkup, and had decided to get rid of Clara without telling her the truth. He had chosen to abandon her, condemning her to the slow deterioration of her health, just to preserve his reputation as an impeccable pastor and model family man. Clara rose from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the garden. The rain had almost stopped, with only occasional large drops falling from the roof to the ground. The sun was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the wet grass and the rose bushes she had never dared to remove after her mother's death. Somewhere out there, 2 miles away, in a cozy house on Elm Street, Nathaniel Brooks was having dinner with his unsuspecting wife, probably preparing for tomorrow's Sunday sermon on forgiveness and loving your neighbor. Something in her chest clenched with pain, but now the pain was joined by rage cold, rational, unfamiliar to her. All her life, Clara had been a quiet, obedient girl who never hurt anyone. At school, when her classmates teased her for her fullness and shyness, she silently tolerated and cried at home. At work, when coworkers passed the buck to her or forgot to wish her a happy birthday, she didn't complain or resent it. But this was something else entirely. This was a betrayal of the worst kind, a betrayal of the man she had trusted not only with her body, but with her soul, with her innermost feelings. Nathaniel hadn't just abandoned her. He deliberately jeopardized her health and life, and then made her feel like a sinner. Clara slowly climbed the narrow staircase upstairs to her bedroom. The room was small, furnished with furniture from her childhood. A white bed, a desk, an old dark wood closet. On the walls hung watercolor landscapes that her mother had painted when she was young. In the corner of the closet, behind the winter dresses, was an old mahogany jewelry box, one of the few things left from her grandmother. After her mother's death, Clara had put all her most precious things in there: letters, photographs, jewelry, and medicine. She pulled out the box and opened it carefully. Inside, among the yellowed photos from the war years and old jewelry, were vials of medicines, those left over from her mother's last illness: morphine in ampules for pain, digoxin in tablets to keep her heart working, and a small glass jar of white pills, the name of which Clara remembered well: strychnine. The doctor then explained that it was a very old medicine, which in microscopic doses was sometimes used as an appetite and heart stimulant for the seriously ill. Her mother had taken a quarter of a tablet once a day, but then her condition had deteriorated so much that the doctors had canceled all medications except painkillers. Clara took the jar in her hands and twirled it in the light. The pills were softly shifting inside. There were 20 of them, maybe more. The label had warnings in small print about the drug's toxicity, that exceeding the dosage could have serious consequences. She set the box on the bed and walked to the window. It was getting dark behind the glass. The short August day was coming to an end. Tomorrow, Sunday, tomorrow at Grace Light Church, the regular service would begin at 10 in the morning. Nathaniel Brooks would deliver another inspirational sermon on mercy, forgiveness, and love of neighbor, and then it would be communion time. Clara has always helped with communion. Deacon Rufus Mayfield, owner of the local funeral home, often asked the most active and reliable parishioners to deliver small glass cups of grape juice. It was an honor to serve the congregation in this way. And the pastor, as was tradition, always took communion first, setting an example for the congregation, showing the importance of this sacred ritual. Closing the box, Clara went downstairs and sat down at the light wood kitchen table. In front of her lay Dr. Henderson's prescription for antibiotics and her cell phone. In the notebook next to the phone was Nathaniel's number. He'd given it to her during their affair, telling her to call in case of an emergency. She should call him right now, tell him about the diagnosis, demand an explanation, make a scene. That's what any normal person in her position would have done. It was what her mother would have done. A straightforward, honest woman who always told the truth to her face and demanded the same of others. But Clara was no longer the person she had been that morning. Something fundamental broke inside her today in the doctor's office as she realized the true extent of the betrayal. Nathaniel Brooks hadn't just broken her heart, he'd destroyed her ability to trust people, her faith in human decency, her naive belief that there was justice in the world. She picked up her phone, found Nathaniel's number, and stared at the screen for a long time. Then she slowly deleted the contact and put the phone in her bag. The clock on the wall showed 10:30 in the evening. There were 12 and a half hours until tomorrow's service. Nathaniel Brooks woke up at 7:30 in the morning, even before the alarm clock rang. It had been his habit for years to get up early on Sunday so that he could prepare for the service, review the sermon again, and get spiritually in tune. Next to her, Delora slept peacefully, covered with a blanket over her head. She had always been an owl and had trouble waking up in the morning, and Nathaniel tried not to wake her unnecessarily. He got up quietly, threw on his robe, and walked into the kitchen. It was still dark outside the window, but a thin streak of dawn was already appearing in the east. Sunday mornings in Broken Arrow were always especially quiet. Even the dogs barked less, as if sensing the sanctity of the day. Nathaniel put the coffee on and pulled eggs for an omelet out of the refrigerator. Cooking calmed him, helped him gather his thoughts before the service. Today's sermon was on the parable of the prodigal son, the theme of forgiveness and second chances. He had chosen it a week ago, but now the words echoed in a special way in his soul. The last few months had not been easy for him. The story with Clara had left a deep wound in his conscience. He had loved her sincerely, or thought he did. This quiet, devoted woman had given him the warmth and understanding he had lacked in his marriage to Delora. But when the doctor announced the diagnosis after a routine checkup, Nathaniel realized it was over. The doctor explained that the disease had been going on covertly, perhaps for months. Nathaniel remembered a brief affair with a woman from a neighboring town before his affair with Clara began a chance encounter at a religious conference, a weakness of the flesh, in a moment of peculiar loneliness. At the time, it had seemed a minor episode, almost forgotten. Now the consequences fell upon him with all their weight. To break off relations with Clara was unbearably painful, but necessary. He couldn't risk her health, couldn't continue to sin knowing he was sick. The treatment had helped. Control tests showed a complete cure, but the weight of guilt remained. He prayed every day for forgiveness, asking the Lord to show him the way to redemption. Nathaniel beat the eggs in a bowl, added milk and spices. The smell of frying bacon filled the kitchen with the comfort of home. In half an hour, Delora would wake up. They would have breakfast together, talk about the day's plans. She'll talk about Sunday school for the kids. He'll share his thoughts on the sermon. A quiet, measured family life that had everything but real intimacy. Delora showed up in the kitchen at 8 sharp, neatly dressed and combed as always. Even in the morning, just waking up, she looked impeccable. Gray dress, hair in a modest bundle, a minimum of makeup. In 12 years of marriage, Nathaniel couldn't remember ever seeing her disheveled or carelessly dressed. "Good morning, darling," she said, giving him a kiss on the cheek. "How did you sleep? Ready for duty?" "I slept fine, thank you. The sermon is ready, I feel inspired," he replied, handing her a plate of omelets. "And how are your kids? Ready for class?" Delora perked up as she talked about the plans for the toddler class. It was the only subject that really excited her, working with children, Sunday school, children's church activities. She was completely different with the children, warm, fun, imaginative. Nathaniel sometimes thought that their marriage would have been very different if they had had children of their own. After breakfast, they drove to church in Nathaniel's old sedan. Delora sat in the front seat, carefully straightening the folds of her dress, placing her purse with the materials for the children's lesson on her lap. They drove in silence, each thinking about the duties ahead. Such was their life, parallel lines that intersected only in everyday trifles. Grace Light Church greeted them with the familiar silence of an empty building. Nathaniel always arrived an hour before the service. They had to check the microphones, go over the hymns with Mrs. Patterson, the organist, and prepare the altar for communion. Delora went to the small room next to the main hall where the children's classes were held. At 10:30, the parishioners began to arrive. The first to arrive, as always, were the Mayfields, Deacon Rufus and his wife Gladys. Rufus was a large man in his 50s, balding, with a bushy mustache and an impressive belly. He owned the only funeral home in town and was considered one of the most respected members of the community. "Good morning, Pastor," Rufus said, shaking Nathaniel's hand firmly. "It's a beautiful Sunday, a blessed day. Are you ready to inspire us? Always ready to serve the Lord and the congregation." Nathaniel smiled. "How are things going at the funeral home? Not much work, I hope?" "Thank God it's quiet. Only old Watson died last week, but he was 86, lived a good life." Rufus shook his head with professional sympathy. "By the way, we'll have to talk about new pews for the church after the service. The old ones were getting a little rusty. Gradually, the church filled with people. The Johnson family with their 3 children took their usual place in the 3rd row. The elderly Mrs. Adams, who never missed a service despite her arthritis, sat down the aisle on the left side. The young Wilson couple, married last year, chose seats closer to the altar. Clara Simmons showed up at the church exactly 10 minutes before the service began. Nathaniel had noticed her at once. She always sat in the 4th row on the right, always alone, always a little apart from the other parishioners. Today, she looked her usual self. Dark blue dress with long sleeves, her hair neatly tucked back, no jewelry except for a small gold cross. Their gazes met for a second, and Nathaniel felt a familiar prick in his heart. Clara nodded to him with the same quiet politeness as the other parishioners, but he saw no warmth or anger in her eyes, only emptiness. That was worse than any reproach. The service began with the traditional hymn, "Amazing Grace," sung by the entire choir to the accompaniment of the old organ. The voices of the congregation merged into a single stream, filling the church with a solemn sound. Nathaniel stood behind the pulpit, watching the singing and at the same time observing the faces of the people in the hall. His congregation was small but friendly. There were families who had been attending the church for the 3rd generation, and recent members who had been attracted by the young pastor's contemporary sermons. The majority were middle-aged and elderly, but there were a few young families with children, and even teenagers. After the hymns and prayers, it was time for the sermon. Nathaniel stepped up to the pulpit, opened his Bible in the place marked beforehand, and looked around at the audience. "Dear brothers and sisters," he began in his usual warm tone, "today I want to talk to you about forgiveness, how the Lord gives each of us a second chance, no matter how deeply we have fallen." He told the parable of the prodigal son, but the words took on a special meaning when he thought of his own sins. The younger son who squandered his inheritance and came home in repentance. The older son who couldn't forgive his brother for his mistakes. The father who received the prodigal son with joy and love. "We are all sinners before God," Nathaniel continued, his voice filled with sincere emotion. "We all make mistakes, give in to temptation, and hurt those close to us. But God is ready to forgive us if we sincerely repent and ask for forgiveness." The congregation listened attentively, some nodding in agreement. Mrs. Adams quietly wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. She always reacted emotionally to sermons. The Johnson family tried to quiet the whispering children. Clara sat motionless with her hands folded in her lap and looked directly at Nathaniel with an inexpressive stare. After the sermon, it was time for communion. Rufus Mayfield rose from his seat and went to the altar, where small glass cups of grape juice and a plate of unleavened bread had been prepared in advance. "Our dear sisters will help us with communion today," Rufus announced. "Mrs. Adams, Mrs. Johnson, Miss Simmons, won't you help us?" Clara rose from her seat and walked down the aisle with the other 2 women. Her movements were calm and confident, her face expressing no emotion. She took one of the trays of cups and stood to the left of the altar. Traditionally, the pastor took communion first, setting an example for the congregation. Nathaniel approached Clara, who stood closest to his seat. She handed him the tray and he took a cup from the edge. "The blood of Christ, shed for us," he said quietly. "Amen," Clara replied, her voice steady and calm. Nathaniel drank the juice in one gulp, as was customary in their church, and placed the empty glass on a special plate. The grape juice seemed a little more tart than usual, but he didn't care. Perhaps they had bought a different brand. Communion continued. Clara and the other helpers went around the rows, serving cups to the congregation. Children received their portion from their mothers. The elderly received communion with special solemnity. There was silence in the church, broken only by the rustle of clothes and quiet words of thanksgiving. When all the congregation had received communion, Nathaniel rose for a final prayer. He felt great, inspired by his own sermon and the atmosphere of unity in the church. The words about forgiveness and second chances resounded in his soul with a special power. "Our Lord Jesus Christ," he began, raising his hands for a blessing. "We thank you for this blessed day, for the opportunity to gather together in your holy house." Suddenly, the words became difficult to say. His tongue became heavy, and there was a strange metallic taste in his mouth. Nathaniel swallowed, trying to continue his prayer, but his voice sounded hoarse. "For your infinite love and mercy." He stopped, feeling dizzy. The congregation looked up, noticing something was wrong. Rufus Mayfield frowned, looking intently at the pastor. Delora in the front row leaned forward worriedly. Nathaniel gripped the edge of the pulpit, trying to keep his balance. His heart sped up, and the blood rushed to his temples. His muscles began to twitch involuntarily. "Pastor Brooks!" Rufus shouted, jumping up from his seat. Nathaniel tried to say he was all right, but all that came out of his mouth was a croak. His legs gave out, and he collapsed behind the pulpit. Convulsions shook his body. His eyes rolled back. Panic broke out in the church. Delora rushed to her husband. The children cried with fright. Rufus ran out to call an ambulance. Mrs. Adams prayed aloud, fiddling with her rosary beads. Clara Simmons remained standing at the altar, holding an empty tray in her hands. The detectives arrived at Grace Light Church 40 minutes after the call. Isaiah Cross parked the squad car near the main entrance, next to an ambulance and a police patrol car. The smell of rain and old bricks hung in the air. The church had been built at the beginning of the last century and retained that special aroma that only old buildings have. Cross had been a detective for 20 years, the last 8 of them working in homicide. A tall, thin man of 42 with a streak of gray in his close-cropped hair, he looked tired of life and human stupidity. He had more than 100 solved cases to his credit, and he had long ago stopped marveling at what a man could do in moments of desperation or rage. His partner, Jasmine Rivers, was 8 years younger and had only been a detective for 4 years. Before that, she had served on the patrol police force, then moved to the juvenile division. She was transferred to homicide after she brilliantly solved a case involving a missing teenager. Rivers was an energetic, observant woman with a keen mind and a way with people. "What do we got?" Cross asked Sergeant Thompson, who was the first to arrive on the scene. 36-year-old male, pastor of a local church, fell during the service, never regained consciousness. EMS pronounced him dead 20 minutes ago. Thompson flipped through his notebook. The doctors tentatively talking heart attack, but asked you to check the scene because of the victim's age. "Witnesses," Rivers clarified, pulling out her clipboard. The entire congregation was in the hall at the time of the incident, 70 people, including children. The victim's wife is in shock, sedated. The others are waiting in the next room. He told the parable of the prodigal son, but the words took on a special meaning when he thought of his own sins. The younger son who squandered his inheritance and came home in repentance. The older son who couldn't forgive his brother for his mistakes. The father who received the prodigal son with joy and love. Cross walked slowly down the hall, studying the surroundings. The church was small, cozy, 12 rows of wooden benches, a simple altar without frills, a few stained glass windows that let in colored light. On the altar were trays with the remains of communion empty glass cups and a plate with slices of bread. "Tell me exactly what happened," he asked CSI Jenkins, who was photographing the altar. According to witnesses, the pastor was conducting a normal Sunday service, a sermon, then communion. After communion, he rose for closing prayer, but suddenly began stuttering, grabbed the pulpit, and fell. Convulsions, loss of consciousness, death occurred before the ambulance arrived. Rivers walked up the aisle, and examined the trays of leftover communion. "Who helped distribute?" she asked. "3 women from the congregation. The deacon selects them from among the active parishioners. Today it was Mrs. Adams, Mrs. Johnson, and Miss Simmons." "Did the pastor take communion?" Cross asked. "Yes, first, as is customary. He drank grape juice, then began the closing prayer." The detectives moved to a small room off the main hall where the witnesses waited. The congregation sat in folding chairs, talking quietly among themselves. Children huddled close to their parents. Older women wiped their eyes with handkerchiefs. The atmosphere was tense. People were clearly in a state of shock. The detectives first decided to question Deacon Rufus Mayfield as the most influential member of the congregation. A large man in a dark suit sat in the corner of the room, holding his hat in his lap. His face expressed deep sorrow and confusion. "Mr. Mayfield," Rivers said, sitting down opposite him, "please tell me what you saw this morning." "Just the usual Sunday service, nothing special." Rufus shook his head. "Pastor Brooks was in high spirits, and the sermon was very inspiring. He talked about forgiveness, about second chances, and then..." He paused, swallowing a lump in his throat. "Did you notice anything unusual in the pastor's behavior?" Cross asked, scrutinizing the deacon's face. "No, nothing. Maybe a little tired the last few weeks, but that's understandable. A lot of work, summer activities at the church. He's a very dedicated pastor, always putting the congregation before his own needs." "And during communion, everything went on as usual?" "Yes, of course. I organized it myself, chose helpers from reliable parishioners. The pastor took communion first, as it should be, and then we distributed it to everyone else." Nothing much happened. Rivers made notes on her clipboard, occasionally raising her eyes to the deacon. "Mr. Mayfield, who prepared the grape juice for communion?" "I do, every Sunday. I buy regular grape juice at the supermarket. Pour it into cups in the morning before the service. The cups are in a locked cabinet in the altar room, with only me and the pastor having access." "Could anyone else have gotten in there?" "Theoretically, yes. The door is unlocked, just a latch. But usually no one goes in there without permission. It's a sacred place for our community." Cross wrote this information down in his notebook. After a few minutes, the deacon was released, and the detectives moved on to interviewing other witnesses. Mrs. Adams, a 73-year-old widow who had helped with communion, was very disturbed by what had happened. She wept as she recounted the last moments of the pastor's life. "Such a young man, such a good man," she sobbed. "The Lord took him in the prime of life. Perhaps he was too good for this sinful world." "Mrs. Adams, you were helping to distribute communion. Did you notice anything unusual?" Rivers asked gently. "No, honey, just the usual. I was standing to the right of the altar, serving the right side of the hall. Miss Simmons was on the left, Mrs. Johnson in the center. The pastor walked over to Ms. Simmons, took his cup, drank, and went to prepare for the closing prayer." "And Miss Simmons herself? How did she behave?" "Her usual quiet, demure self. She's always like that, rarely talks to anyone, but she's a very reliable girl. She's been very withdrawn since her mother died, poor thing." Mrs. Johnson was interviewed next, a young woman with 3 children. She looked frightened, but she was more collected. "I saw the pastor take communion," she said. "Everything was normal, no problems. He drank the juice, put the cup on the tray, and walked away. We continued to distribute to the rest of the congregation." "Did you notice anything strange about the taste of the grape juice?" Cross asked. "No, it tasted the same as always. I didn't pay much attention, though. I was busy with my children, making sure they behaved themselves. When it was Clara Simmons' turn, the detective saw a thin, middle-aged woman in a dark blue dress. She sat apart from the others with her hands folded in her lap and stared out the window with an absent look. There were no tears on her face, but it expressed a deep sadness. "Miss Simmons?" Rivers addressed her. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." Clara turned to the detectives and nodded. "Of course. Anything I can do to help. It's such a tragedy, such an unexpected loss for all of us." Her voice was quiet but firm. Cross noticed that the woman's hands weren't shaking, her breathing steady. She was clearly well in control of her emotions. "You helped with communion this morning. Tell me how it went," Rivers asked. "Deacon Mayfield asked me and 2 other women to help. We took trays of cups and stood at the altar. Pastor Brooks came to me first. I was closest to where he was standing. He took the cup, said the traditional words, drank the juice." "Did you notice anything unusual in his demeanor?" "No, nothing. He looked his usual self, focused, a little solemn. Communion has always been a very important part of the service for him." "And after he drank the juice?" "He put the empty cup on a special plate and walked back to the pulpit. We continued to distribute communion to the rest of the congregation. Nothing unusual happened until the end of the service." Cross studied the woman's face, trying to catch signs of lying or excitement. But Clara Simmons spoke in a steady, calm voice, didn't avoid his gaze, didn't make any unnecessary gestures. It seemed she was really just a shocked parishioner who had lost her pastor. "Ms. Simmons, how long have you been attending this church?" Rivers asked. "My whole life. My mom took me here since I was a little girl. Since her death 2 years ago, the church has become especially important to me because it's where I feel connected to her, to my family's traditions." "Did you know Pastor Brooks well?" "As did the rest of the congregation. He came to us 3 years ago, a very good preacher, a kind man, always willing to help, listen, support in times of need." After interviewing Clara, detectives talked to several other witnesses, but they didn't get any new information. All told the same story: an ordinary Sunday service, which was tragically cut short by the sudden death of the young pastor. Finally, the detectives decided to talk to the widow. Delora Brooks sat in her husband's study in a small room behind the altar. The sedative had calmed her down a bit, but her eyes were still red with tears. "Mrs. Brooks, we're sorry for your loss," Rivers said, sitting down next to the woman. "We understand how hard this is for you, but we need to ask some questions." I understand," Delora whispered. "Do what you have to do." "Has your husband complained of any health problems lately?" "No, nothing serious. Sometimes he said he was tired, had a headache after a long day. But he never went to the doctors, said he didn't have time." "Any history of heart disease in the family?" "His father had a heart attack at the age of 58. But Nathaniel had always been healthy, played sports as a young man, didn't smoke, hardly drank alcohol." Cross noticed that the widow spoke of her husband with some detachment. The grief was sincere, but it lacked the deep intimacy that comes between people who have lived many years in a happy marriage. "Mrs. Brooks, did your husband have any enemies? Conflicts with any of the parishioners?" he asked cautiously. "No. Nathaniel was a very gentle man who never quarreled with anyone. Everyone in the congregation loved and respected him. He was a true pastor, kind, patient, always ready to help." After talking to the widow, the detectives returned to the main hall of the church. The forensics team was finishing up their work, packaging the remains of the communion for analysis. The pastor's body had already been taken to the morgue for autopsy. "What do you think?" Cross asked his partner when they were alone. "Looks like a natural death," Rivers replied, looking over the notes. "Young male, but it happens. Stress, heredity, poor lifestyle. No obvious signs of violence or poisoning. Still, it's odd, though. 36 years old, relatively healthy lifestyle. And these seizures that witnesses described don't look like a regular heart attack. The autopsy will tell us. If it's a heart attack, the case will be closed in a couple days. If it's something else, we'll look into it." The detectives took another look at the scene, talked to the forensics team, and left the church. During their work, the sky had finally cleared of clouds. The sun shone brightly on the quiet streets of Broken Arrow. An ordinary Sunday afternoon in a small town that had suddenly been marred by tragedy. Cross started the car and drove slowly towards the station. "We'll schedule the autopsy for tomorrow morning," he said. "It's too early to draw conclusions, but I don't like this story. It's too smooth, too convenient." "You suspect murder?" Rivers wondered. I don't know yet. 20 years on the job, I've just learned not to trust the obvious. Let's see what the pathologist has to say. Dr. Elizabeth Carter called the detectives Tuesday morning when Cross had just arrived at the station with a cup of coffee from a vending machine. Detective Cross? I have the autopsy results on Pastor Brooks. You better come and take a look at it in person. The pathologist's voice sounded worried. Something wrong with the heart attack? His heart was in perfect condition. I found strychnine in his blood. Pretty high dosage. Definitely a homicide. Half an hour later, the detectives were standing in the morgue going over the test results. Strychnine is a classic poison, Dr. Carter explained. Symptoms are muscle spasms, seizures, 20 minutes from ingestion to death. Timeline fits with communion. Could it have been slipped into the grape juice without being noticed? Easy. Strychnine's bitter, but sweet juice masks it, especially if you drink it in one gulp. The detectives returned with the realization that they were now facing a full-blown murder investigation. They made a list of everyone who had access to the communion and began to dig deeper into the victim's identity. Rufus Mayfield agreed to meet at his funeral home. When he heard about the strychnine, he went pale. Oh my God, so someone really did kill the pastor, but he had no enemies. Who had access to the altar room where communion was prepared? Theoretically, any parishioner. The door's unlocked. But usually it's just me, the pastor, and sometimes his wife. Tell us about the people who helped with communion. Mrs. Adams and Mrs. Johnson are of impeccable reputation, and Ms. Simmons became very withdrawn after her mother's death, but was active in helping the pastor with church business. The detectives split up. Rivers went to visit the widow, while Cross went to investigate the pastor's past. Delora Brooks met the detective in a black dress, red-eyed. Tell me about your relationship, Rivers asked. We were partners rather than lovers. For the past year, he'd been distant, lingering with his parishioners. I suspected infidelity, but I didn't want to know the details. Do you have suspicions? Ms. Simmons. He praised her constantly, then abruptly stopped mentioning her in February. Rivers also learned that Nathaniel had a physical in January and became very nervous after seeing the doctor. Cross obtained Brooks's medical records. The January file listed treatment for syphilis, a course of antibiotics completed by March. Back at the station, the detectives cross-referenced the information. The picture was clear. The pastor had an affair with Clara, infected her, then dumped her without telling her she was sick. We've got motive, Rivers said. We just need to find the evidence. During the re-examination of the church, forensics found in the trash can empty vial from the drug Ruth Simmons, with a drug containing strychnine, discarded recently, possibly on Sunday. Clara Simmons was called in for questioning. She came in calmly, wearing the same dark dress. Miss Simmons, the parson was poisoned with strychnine, Rivers reported. We found your mother's medicine bottle behind the church. For the first time, Clara's face showed concern, but she quickly pulled herself together. I don't understand how it could have gotten there. We know about your relationship with the pastor, Rivers continued softly. We know he gave you syphilis and left you. You had reason to hate him. Clara froze, staring wide-eyed. You know about it? She whispered. We know everything, Cross confirmed. Clara lowered her head, silent for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. Yes, I killed him, and I have no regrets. She talked about the affair that had been true love for her, the diagnosis that had shattered her world, the realization of betrayal. He talked about love, promised a divorce, and then he threw me away and didn't even warn me about the disease. He ruined my life. He had to pay for it. Clara described in detail how she planned the murder. She crushed strychnine tablets from her mother's medication and poured them into a capsule. On Sunday morning, she volunteered to help with communion and discreetly added the poison to the cup intended for the pastor. I had no doubts, she confessed. Even as I watched him die, he got what he deserved. After the arrest, The detectives were left in an empty room. "What do you think?" Rivers asked. "People are capable of terrible things when they feel betrayed," replied Cross. Clara had been law-abiding all her life, but one betrayal turned her into a murderer. "Tomorrow, we'll turn the case over to the prosecutor." They left the station at dusk. The streetlights were on. People were hurrying home. Cross thought that justice had been served, but there were no winners in this story.